This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. A cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel begins today's show. He discusses the continued record-high market and his concerns and excitement. Keeping the show moving is Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, explaining prairie dogs and the issues they create, as well as the various methods of control. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, ends the show sharing about podworms and headworms and the problems they cause for soybean and sorghum growers. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you today, Shelby.
Derrell, what are we seeing for the cattle market?
You know, these cattle markets just continue to march on across the board. Feeder cattle markets, fed cattle markets, all the markets continue to just step higher. Seems like we set new records almost on a daily basis. And so, the markets continue very strong. We're not seeing a lot of seasonality really in these markets. We're just trending up and kind of moving higher most of the time.
You mentioned setting new records, and is that something we're seeing with boxed beef?
We're very, very close to boxed beef, and essentially we are at record levels for boxed beef. They've moved sharply higher. And after Labor Day, you think about it, that's a little surprising. We think of Labor Day being kind of the end of summer grilling season, and yet boxed beef continues to move higher. The only 2 weeks in history that were higher than where we have been lately with boxed beef was during the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic. There were about 2 weeks when the boxed beef cutout value was higher, but that really doesn't count. That was an extremely unusual situation. So for all intents and purposes, boxed beef is at a high historic level as well.
What do you think is keeping that demand up?
We just continue to see the really strong demand. Preferences are obviously key to this. Consumers want to eat beef. They've got lots of choices. Pork and poultry are in ample supply and very favorably priced. If you look at the retail price ratios between beef and pork and poultry, beef continues to move higher relative to those other meats. And so, we see that. At the same time, we're also seeing beef supplies tighten up a little bit as we've been moving lower on beef production since about the second quarter of this year. So when you combine, declining production with strong demand, you're going to be operating at higher price levels.
In all your years of working in the cattle market, the livestock market, have you ever seen anything like this?
We've never seen anything like any of what we're seeing now. Obviously, price levels for cattle, for beef across the board are at levels that nobody really would have anticipated even just a few months ago, probably, let alone historically anything like this. So we've continued to move into completely unprecedented territory with these markets.
What do you think will be that trigger to make us go to our next phase of the cattle cycle?
Probably one of the biggest questions I've been getting for quite a few months, but especially here lately, producers understandably are concerned about when does this market top out? What does the backside of this thing look like? And that's natural, particularly when you remember what happened in about 10 years ago, the last time we had record high prices. They lasted a couple of years and then we went back down pretty sharply. This time it looks different. The conditions that will put a top in this market really come after we start saving heifers and starting to rebuild the herd. Again, if you look at the last cattle cycle previous to this one, it was about a year to a year and a half after heifer retention started when we put the high prices in. And we don't have any evidence yet, really, that we've even started heifer retention. So that tells me that the high prices are not in 2025. They may not even be in 2026. And so we're still going to grind higher. Probably we won't move as higher as fast as we have. We may slow down that pace of increase, but I think we're going to grind higher here, certainly through 2026.
You mentioned heifer retention, and do you think that's going to be something that all the states kind of just happen to start at the same time, or a couple of states will lead that?
That's an interesting question. I mean, if you look at conditions, as far as physical conditions, other than the extreme west, we've got drought in some parts of the west that would certainly limit things. But most of the rest of the country doesn't really have those kind of limitations. So it's just going to depend on what producers do. We even saw some indications last year of some of the big beef cattle states in the center part of the country kind of leading the way with individually with some increase in heifers and so on. So I think it'll probably build. I mean, if you look from North Dakota south through the middle of the country down through Texas, you got about 40% of the beef cows in that part of the country. And that's probably where the growth will begin. But, again, we haven't measured it as yet.
And while we're not really seeing a lot of growth in our cattle industry right now, is that the same for different continents and countries?
It's not the same. Everybody's on a little different situation. Now, in North America, we tend to kind of follow each other. So Canada's been in a similar situation, although Canada just released some new inventory numbers that says that maybe they have started to grow. So that's a little bit of a change. Maybe that's a leading maybe that's an indicator of what's coming in the U.S. Mexico also has had a lot of drought issues at times, not so much right now. So their numbers have been down. So we've been generally tight on cattle numbers across North America.
What about for Australia?
Australia has been kind of almost in an opposite cycle to the U.S. When we had big numbers a few years ago, we peaked in 2019 with our inventories. They had very, very low levels. They had drought and fires and all kinds of things. They've rebuilt since then, got their numbers back up to a little more normal levels. And so they've come on strong in terms of their beef production, their beef exports the last couple of years. And, they're really playing a little bit bigger role in the global market right now.
And how does what Canada and Mexico have really impact what's happening in our market?
Well, there's some direct trade, obviously, on North America between Canada, U.S., and Mexico for both cattle and for beef. So, those things there. In terms of global markets, of course, the biggest factor we've seen in terms of beef exports is the fact that we're not trading with China right now too much. And I do know that Australia is one of the places that is coming on strong. Even for fed beef in Australia, they've continued to develop over many years a fed beef industry. And so they issued numbers not too long ago that showed that about 29% of Australian beef exports now are fed cattle, feedlot cattle, not just the range beef that we often think of when we think of Australia.
And Derrell, bringing things back home, you've mentioned that it depends on how producers feel of what conditions and things they have to feed to their cattle. So right now, as we look at wheat, how are your cattle producers in Oklahoma feeling?
It's been a very unusual August in Oklahoma. We had some unseasonably cool weather. We got quite a bit of rain at a time of year when those wheat producers that want to plant early for forage production are in a great opportunity. I've talked to producers in the last week or so that are planting wheat or getting ready to plant wheat. We're going to have some wheat pasture, probably the best conditions we've had in several years. So, one of the questions is how are they going to utilize that forage, and will they utilize it for their cows and calves? They can do that. Traditional stockers is certainly something they're interested in, but we know that feeder cattle supplies are extremely tight right now. And actually, if you do the budgets, they're a little bit tricky. I won't say they don't work, but I think producers have to approach it pretty carefully. And so, maybe one of the things they're going to do is use this wheat pasture. It's high quality forage. Maybe they're going to use that to retain some heifers and grow them out. We'll have to wait and see.
When you look forward to the market, do you see any concerns, Derrell?
Well, we continue to be nervous about this market just because of the levels we're at. Anytime you're at record levels, the odds have to favor down, a correction to the downside as opposed to continued up, even though the fundamentals and the numbers tell us that we're not done going higher. So I think producers are kind of understandably nervous. We've seen some early marketing of calves this fall at these record prices simply because producers want to make sure they don't miss out on it. And I don't think they're going to, but I understand why they feel that way. But we don't have any real concerns. No reason to think that things are changing. We continue to monitor demand. There's no signs of weakness at this point there. And again, the overall numbers and the fundamentals taken collectively says that we're still in extremely strong shape in this cattle industry.
So on the flip side of being concerned, what makes you excited?
Well, we've got an opportunity here I think we're going to spend much of the second half of the decade in this general kind of an environment with elevated prices. At some point in here, we'll probably start to grow. That's actually going to squeeze it even higher. And yet then we're going to, there will be a time when we produce our way back into lower prices, but I don't think that's going to happen before the end of the decade at the earliest.
We talked about feedlots in Canada and Australia. If people would like to read more on this topic or other topics from you, Derrell, how can they do that?
Yeah, we've written a weekly newsletter for a long time. It's called the Cow-Calf Corner Newsletter. You can go to beefextension.com, which is beef. It's at Oklahoma State University. There's a link to the Cow-Calf Corner Newsletter and a link to the sign up for that newsletter.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. I'm happy to visit with you.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. You can read his recent article titled Less Cattle in U.S. Feedlots, More Cattle in Canada and Australia by following the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you are also able to navigate to it by going to extension.ok-state.edu. Once again, that is extension.ok-state.edu. I will also link that in today's show notes on agtoday.net if you'd like to read other articles from Derrell and the team at Oklahoma State. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about prairie dogs with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, what's some background information about prairie dogs?
Well, prairie dogs, there's 5 different species in North America. In the Great Plains and Kansas, the black-tailed prairie dog is the most common species, and it's the only species of prairie dog that we have in Kansas. Historically, they were really, really widespread throughout the Great Plains, especially in short grass and mixed grass prairies. In 1900, it's estimated that there was about 2 million acres of prairie dogs just in Kansas. That's about how many acres of black-tailed prairie dogs there is in the entire U.S. nowadays. So their distribution and abundance has drastically been reduced. A lot of that reduction has been due to conversion of prairies to row crop agriculture and also poisoning or eradication campaigns because of the competition that they have with cattle. They're one of those species that has a lot of negative feelings associated with them because of that competition with cattle, because of the burrow systems that they create in their towns, the big holes, the big mounds of soil that are associated with those holes that make it hard to drive across or maybe hard to ride a horse across and those sorts of things. But they're an ecologically important species. They're what we call a keystone species, and that's because they create habitat in an area that wouldn't otherwise be there. And they do that in a couple of different ways. There are some species that depend on the burrow systems that they create. There are also species that depend on the areas of really closely clipped off short vegetation that dominate their prairie dog towns. So just some examples of some different species that depend on prairie dogs would be mountain plovers. Black-footed ferrets are entirely dependent on prairie dogs. Swift fox benefit from prairie dog colonies. Rattlesnakes, which a lot of people also have negative associations with, and then jackrabbits too.
What type of competition do they have with cattle?
Sure. So the main thing that we have here is competition for forage. A prairie dog's diet really directly overlaps with the diet of cattle. The studies that have looked at this have shown as much as 85% overlap between the species that the prairie dogs ate and the species that the cattle ate. I mentioned that they also clip vegetation off. They want to be able to see really long distances because that allows them to detect predators coming in from a long ways away, and to be safe. And so not only do they eat vegetation, they also cut it off, and so then it's not available to the cattle. And there's lots and lots of published estimates of how much a prairie dog might eat relative to how much a cow eats. But there was a really good study in eastern Colorado, so a little bit different system, really arid. It'd be close to the shortgrass prairies in western Kansas. What they found was over 10 years, with wet years, dry years, and average rainfall years, your average loss for stalkers at 60% occupancy by prairie dogs in a pasture was almost 24 pounds per stalker. And so, that's a real cost to a cattle producer of having this critter out there. And so it's important to understand how to control these critters. It's clearly something that we've been pretty good at with how much they've been reduced, but we are coming into the time of the year when we start thinking about prairie dog control on a large scale for agricultural producers, because it's the time of the year when the label opens up on the most common rodenticides that are used for prairie dog control. So from October 1 to the middle of March 15th, the first generation anticoagulant products, chlorofascinone and diafascinone, those are the products that people typically think about as being poison grains that are applied down in the burrow. And those, from some research in Kansas in years past, have been shown to be the most effective. There's also a product called zinc phosphide, or the active ingredient is zinc phosphide. That label runs from the middle of July through January. And that product is an acute toxicant rather than being an anticoagulant product. There's some more risks associated with that to the applicator. It's also more toxic to more species if we're thinking about effects on non-targets and that sort of thing. So that one is also available. All those products are labeled only for use in rangelands and associated non-cropland areas. If we have prairie dogs in croplands, or if we need to treat an area that is rangeland outside of the label period, then we would need to use a fumigant. The common fumigant products that we have available are aluminum phosphide and magnesium phosphide, and they're commonly known as phostoxin. That's either in a pellet or a tablet. We put those down into the burrow. That product reacts with the soil, with moisture in the soil, produces a poisonous gas, and kills everything in the burrow. Because that stuff is so toxic, you have to apply for a permit. In addition to being a pesticide applicator, you have to apply for a permit called a Prairie Dog Control permit. That can be applied for through an extension office or directly through my website at K-State. I look at those, approve them or not, and then send them on to Wildlife and Parks, and that permit would be issued by Wildlife and Parks for that product.
When we're looking at those toxicants and the label is from October 1st to March 15th, is there a time frame within that usually they seem to be the most effective?
Sure. So these products, it's hard to get a prairie dog to choose to eat dry grain over green vegetation, which is what they want the most. So the nastier, the colder it is during that non-growing season time period, the more of that stuff they're going to eat and the more effective it will be. And so, if we have a bad prairie dog problem out in a pasture and we're really wanting to get good control on them, if there's a bad cold front coming in that might have deep snow associated with it or something like that, then applying that product right before that bad cold front, sometimes we get 100% control with one treatment with that product. And so that would be the most effective time, but definitely when there's not green growing vegetation out there. The other thing too that I forgot to mention is all of these products, the toxicants and the fumigants, are restricted use pesticides. So you're going to need to be a pesticide applicator in order to legally apply those.
And Drew, what's another option for control, but maybe not the most effective?
Sure, sure. So sometimes people think about shooting, and most of the time when shooting is done for prairie dogs, it's done as a recreational activity, and it's not something that folks do really, really intentionally and for long periods of time. And shooting can be effective, and especially as a follow-up method to control prairie dogs in areas of rangeland. Let's say we've applied our toxicants during that period when the label's open, but then in May we realize we still have some more prairie dogs out there and we need to control those. Then going out there and being very intentional, spending lots of time and weeding out those last few stragglers that the toxicants didn't get. That's how we would apply shooting as an effective control method. And then another way that I've helped folks when we had kind of strange situations, maybe we had prairie dogs in a fairgrounds that were coming over from a neighboring pasture. We used body gripping traps that are commonly used for trapping muskrats to trap the prairie dogs, only the prairie dogs that were coming off the rangeland into that fairgrounds. And we weren't able to effectively predict when the prairie dogs would be in those burrows to apply the fumigants in an efficient way. And so that's why we chose that in those specific instances.
Do people need to do anything if they have effectively killed other prairie dogs and all those burrows are still there?
Sure. So that's a really good question. So when prairie dogs disperse, or when they're leaving the area that they were born and trying to find a new area, they almost always stop or recolonize old prairie dog colonies rather than creating entirely new colonies in places where they didn't exist before. And so when those dispersing prairie dogs, what they're looking for are those open holes in the mounds that would be in that colony that we poisoned. And so it can be important after you poison out or control a prairie dog colony to go back through and level out that colony, use a land plane type implement to fill in those holes and level everything back out.
Drew, if people have any questions on anything you've talked about today related to prairie dogs, what's your recommendation?
Sure. So a couple of different sources. Always your local extension office is a great resource to use. www.wildlife.K-State.edu is my website. And there's a page on there for prairie dogs. If you click on the different species, prairie dogs is one of those. And we've got a really good prairie dog control publication on there that folks can use. There's also a podcast from when we first started our Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast about prairie dog control, where we discuss these things in pretty good detail as well.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. I will link the resources that he mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing podworms and headworms with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, podworms, headworms, are they the same thing?
Yes, it's just different crops. There are several different Lepidopterous larvae, moth larvae, worms, as the growers call them, that get into the marketable product, whether it be corn, sorghum, soybeans, cotton, whatever. And so they can cause a problem when they're in the marketable product. Right now, the corn's past the stage where anything's going to hurt them as far as an insect goes, but we still have some double-cropped soybeans and sorghum, which are struggling in the reproductive stages. And there are some Lepidopterous larvae out there, mainly corn earworms. I think they'll be going away. Armyworms are the culprit that I'm worried about now, and fall armyworms. I think the fall armyworms and the corn earworms will be out of here, but the armyworms can be a problem. They all do the same kind of damage for the most part. First, let me talk about sorghum. Sorghum, I have seen the most damage in the head due to armyworms than any other worm, period. We usually worry about corn earworms. and they can be a problem, but the corn earworm is very antagonistic or cannibalistic. So there can be 2 or 3 eggs deposited in the head of a sorghum plant, but there's only going to be one larvae at the end feeding. So they can cause damage, but that's not the case with armyworms. Armyworms, they'll feed, and they're very happy to be in association with each other. So you can have many larvae feeding on the head of a sorghum plant or the heads of sorghum plants and on the pods of soybeans. The rule of thumb is 5% loss per worm per head in sorghum. And they're feeding on the marketable product. So you got to get out and look. Sorghum, to me, just as it comes into heading, as it starts to flower, that's when you need to get out and just take a 1 gallon white bucket, bend the head over and vigorously shake it against the sides of the bucket. Do that for 10 plants, count the number of worms. That tells you what % damage you can expect. But sorghum's only vulnerable for the headworms from flowering to about soft dough. Once it gets to soft dough, the berries or the kernels, whatever you want to call them, are too hard for the larvae to chew on. There may be some larger worms there, but they're not going to do any more damage. The soybeans, it's about 1 per row foot. If you're out and you're sampling your soybeans or you're monitoring your soybeans and they still have green pods, those worms can feed on the seed within the pod for about 2 weeks. So if you're out sampling your soybeans and there's green pods, you see holes right where the seed's going to be, that's a worm. That's not the beetle, the bean leaf beetle, that's a worm. Now, if you're out and you're sampling, you see the holes and they're just kind of starting to turn brown or black around the hole and you don't find any worms, don't spray. The worms are only going to be out there feeding for about 2 weeks also. Now, again, it's all driven by the weather. If it cools down, it may be 16 days instead of 14. If it's too hot, it's not going to be faster than 14 days. So keep that in mind. But if you don't find the worms themselves, you just find the holes, I would hold off treating and just keep sampling. I think we will have another generation of armyworms. We're right in that period in the early fall, whether we may not or not, but I don't think we will for fall armyworms. I don't think we will for corn earworms. Armyworms are what I'm worried about now. Just a word to the wise, get out and check, and you got about, maybe another 2 weeks when these larvae will be out and about, and then hopefully it'll be a couple of weeks before they come on again. So, armyworms, they are native to Kansas, so they're going to overwinter in Kansas. The overwintering stage that I've seen are the larvae, the late, larger larvae, so they're going to be feeding until temperatures get into the mid to lower 20s at night for a couple of hours. That will kind of cut them off and they'll go into the overwintering. For now, it's the late planted soybeans and sorghum that we're worried about because of the marketable product susceptibility on these worms. There are some aphids around, but I've not seen any aphid populations enough to worry about.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.